want to pick up from our last program is really, I find it's very interesting, according to jns.org, where the official U.S. map, or maps, to show the Golan belongs to Israel. The U.S. State Department announced this week that it will update its map to reflect the Trump administration's move to officially recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. A department spokesman told Voice of America the map's modification would be consistent with the proclamation of the president signed on Monday, remarking that the United States recognized the Golan Heights as part of the state of Israel. I think that's huge. As you look at this, of course, as we mentioned last week, and we'll be putting up a map here for you as you see up there where the Golan Heights is. And the Golan Heights is really a place really important to Israel, as we'll be taking a look at here. In fact, let's look at it right now, as I have another article written by a dear brother. His name is Joel Rosenberg, and you might want to take a look at his blog work that he does. It's Joel C. Rosenberg. He writes, he says, a historical, moral, wise decision. President Trump was right to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And then he writes, here's why. President Trump made history this week by signing an official proclamation declaring the United States now recognize the sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He did so during a Monday ceremony in the Oval Office with Israel's Prime Minister. And he says, I commend President Trump and Vice President Pence for making this moral, correct, wise, and long overdue decision. And I pray that the U.S. and Israel will continue to work even more closely together to prevent Russia, Iran, Turkey from taking over Syria and making it towards an operation base where they can attack the Jewish state. So vital is the area, as you see back behind me, the map of the Golan Heights. Joel goes on and he writes, I think, some important little background of the reason why this is so important. I'll highlight a few of them. He says in 1967, Syria planned and prepared to use the Golan Heights as a launching pad for a massive invasion of Israel. Their goal to help Egypt's President Gamal Nasser to throw the Jews into the seas, what they said, and utterly wipe out the Jewish state. There was a real purpose of getting this site as they were working together with Egypt. If you can look back in history, look back if you were around, alive there in 1967, you remember that amazing war, and the purpose was to wipe out Israel at that time. And it goes on, he says, Syria plans, however, were stopped or thwarted when Israel won what is known as the Six-Day War, stunning all the Arab states and took possession of the Golan Heights. And so this is when it happened in 1967, where they took possession of the Golan Heights. In 1973, Syria again planned and prepared to invade Israel and utterly to destroy the Jewish state. In close cooperation with the Egyptian, Damascus launched a massive surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the highest holy day of the Jewish calendars. However, of course, Syria's plans were once again stopped, thwarted, precisely because Israel now controlled where? The Golan Heights, the commanding point, as Joel goes on here and writes. It's an amazing article. Again, you might want to take a look at it. As he kind of concludes his blog, this information that he wanted to put out there, he says, imagine if Israel had handed the territory back. That's kind of a frightful thought. As he lists, he says, would Israel have been safe from a man who murdered more than 500,000 people in recent years? Of course, we saw that in the news, and how not only did they not afraid to use chemical weapons, as he used chemical weapons against his own people. Would Israel be safe from really from all these invading armies, to wipe them out? And so the Golan Heights is a very important stance that not only the Israel's making to make sure that it stays within their borders, and then as the United States has made that decision by President Trump that this border the Golan Heights belongs to the nation of Israel for protection, for security. My goodness, we talk about that in the news every day about security as we look at the walls, the southern borders that President Trump is so much advocating to get built. It is being built. The whole idea is security, to keep us safe. And that's what the Golan Heights represents to Israel, is to really truly to keep the people of the nation safe from those who would want to destroy it. So I want to applaud President Trump for making this stance, and as we continue to pray for the nation of Israel, and we'll be keeping you posted of other events that will be happening in future programs. But check it out, because we are dealing with what's happening in the world this day in Israel and concerning the peace plan. And I'm here with my good friend Chris Catano over at Calvary Old Path as we're looking into God's Word, and as we're instructed to. I was mentioned last week where Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians, as he tells us that we're children of the day, and that, not children of the night. Really what he's talking about is that we should have that understanding of the last days and biblical understanding. God wants us to be aware of the days that we're living in, and I've asked Chris to really share some foundational scriptures to us, and then we're going to get into some events that's happening in Israel today. So Chris, why don't you take us to the book of Isaiah and share a little bit out of it?
And we did that on the last program too, because what you have in this for about 8 chapters, starting at chapter 40, is God talking to the nation, but also trying to stake out for the people of that nation that don't rely on the foreign gods. They can't communicate. They can't tell you as I've told you. But he also addresses the nations around, and I think it's really poignant for what we're looking at in the text, not the text, but in these articles that we're reading. But in verse 12 of chapter 40, he asks a series of questions, and of course they're rhetorical, because nobody could answer. He says, "Now, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, measured heaven with the span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in the balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding?" So God is here. Who was it that told me in the first place?
Who was his professor?
Sure, and he makes it just an absurdity by asking the questions.
Yes.
So he ends up answering his own question. "Behold, the nations are just as a drop in a bucket, and they are counted as small as dust on a scale. Look, he lifts up the isles as a very little thing, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor its beasts sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted by him as less than nothing and worthless." So these are the nations that had troubled Israel, and here is he giving comfort to the nation of Israel at this time and telling them there is none like me. And he says this so much in the following chapters, but I think it's instructive for us when we start to think about God telling us of future events, and we read about them right here in front of us. At any particular time, we can take a look, especially since Israel is now back as a nation.
Yeah.
It's changed the whole news cycle of the Middle East, and how do you deal with it? It goes along with, if I could say this one last thing, when God says that through Zechariah that God would make Israel a cup of trembling to the nations, which is an amazing thing, because since Zechariah had those things written, that has never been the case until now.
It's I love what you just read, and I just like where you said in verse 15, "Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket." When we lose sight of sometimes of the awesomeness of God, how God's in control, and as we saw last week, as Chris was sharing about how God's the one who's able to speak to things in advance, even before the events happen, and they come to true 100% of the time. He says it's nothing too hard for him. And as nations are a drop in the bucket, and sometimes we think we're pretty mighty here in the United States, don't we, Chris?
Sure.
But when you look at from God's perspective, and that's what he's trying to get us a good picture of, he's still in control. He's in control of what's happening in the Middle East, and he hasn't lost sight of Israel. As I believe Israel's still the apple of their eye. He still sees them, and we find some very interesting articles written about a new proposal, a new peace plan that's happening right now before us. A lot of us don't know about it because it doesn't necessarily make the mainline news because they're too busy worried about trying to impeach Trump and do all kinds of other things, But yet it's there, it's happening. And this is an article out of Newsweek that we're looking at. And I just want to read one of the paragraphs, Chris, and then have you talk about this new peace plan. We read that Trump's director, senior advisor, and son-in-law Jared Kushner and White House Middle East envoy Jason Greenblatt, I believe is how you say it, to create a peace plan that could bring the end to generations of conflict between Israeli and Palestinians. The White House stayed tight-lipped on when the proposal would be released in full, though Kushner indicated that in April, the administration would start unveiling the plan after Ramadan, which ends on June 4th. So what are we talking about here?
Well, what we know is that they want to put this out in writing. They've already tipped their hand a little bit that it's going to be a totally different way of doing things. What they want to do is not focus on all the political things and the land things. They want to try to bring investment and dangle, if you will, kind of a carrot in front of people and said, let's get to peace by prosperity. And so let's take care of all the economic woes, which is half of what they complain about over there. But they always try to tie it to Israel's making us miserable because they're occupying our land and we have no opportunity. It's obviously it's nonsense, but to the rank and file of the public, they don't understand that. So here, Trump and his administration, and because of the leading of Kushner and others, they said, well, let's take care of the financial stuff first. And once we can get everything there, we'll take that off the table, and now we can bring the politicians and say, see, it's a prosperous future. It always works this way. No matter what is proposed, immediately the Palestinian, quote, leadership is going to give reasons why it won't work. And here's the bottom line. If they could ever fix the problem, then there would be no reason for them to exist anymore, and it would also mean that Israel would allow such things to take place, and they're no longer the enemy. So they have a vested interest in shooting this down, and it's why you see, though it hasn't even rolled out, it still can't, it's from when we're taping, it's still a week away. Ramadan's happening as we are here, right now. This is what we read from one of their representatives. The administration is preparing, quote, to give its stamp of approval to Israel's colonial policies. This official said, the administration has shown nothing but disregard for Palestinian rights and Palestinian lives. And so ultimately, the only thing that the Trump administration has done is said, well, Israel should have control over the Golan Heights. We should move our embassy to Israel or to Jerusalem, and they haven't done a whole lot more. But this is a way of trying to poison everything before it even starts because they have no desire for peace. It goes on, Israel's, quote, colonial control of Palestinian territories is, al-Maliki suggested, designed to ensure confinement and expansion of Israel settlers with the objective of maximum land with minimum Palestinians. It is totally the opposite because there aren't Jews there.
If I would just read that, it's almost like they're saying that Israel's really doing some type of genocide, trying to remove everybody that's a non-Jew by occupying more land, building more settlements, and pushing all the non-Jews out, the Arabs and everybody else out
Sure.
of the land, and that's their claim against it. But we know it's not to be true at all, And so, what Kushner's saying is that we're going to take it to the people. If I understand what this article is saying, is that we're taking it to the people and say, we want to make sure your economical status is increased by bringing in business, by giving yourself a stable place to live, and you'll prosper. And then I think you said last week's program that they will then put pressure on the politicians to say, let's don't goof this up.
Now, it sounds great on paper, but
it sounds real good.
Anybody that's ever, especially anybody who's ever been there to observe it with their own eyes, knows this to be true. It's not a lack of money and funding. It's like every place else that is run by corrupt people. The people in power are able to take all the money that comes in, and they keep it to themselves, and it never makes it to the people. That's the problem. So that doesn't change. It happens everywhere else in the world, but there is the misinformation by the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, or now what is called the Palestinian Authority, of giving disinformation to the people, stirring up hatred against Israel. But then you also have the problem of Western journalism. When we think of Newsweek, we think they're supposed to be objective journalists. But read this article, or read this paragraph here. This is just opinion journalism at its worst. It's agenda-driven. While offering near unquestioning support of Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a self-described nationalist who heads arguably the most right-wing government in the country's history, the Trump administration also cut tens of millions of dollars of funding for Palestinian security services and refugee organizations. Now, first of all, that is agenda-driven because it really mocks who Netanyahu is, but it also questions us for saying, finally, look, you're a bunch of terrorists. We're done sending money to terrorists.
Yeah, that's Trump's a terrible man. What this fellow's saying is that he's supporting. What do? Are we supposed to continue to put on this tens of millions of dollars to support these guys that are known terrorists?
Right.
And Trump's, we got to be thankful for him that he was willing to step up to the plate and say, no, we're not going to do it. But yet he's going to face the problems that are just going to continue on with this,
Exactly.
But not just Newsweek. And I find it's interesting that we're looking at these, quote, you might say liberal magazines or newspapers, Newsweek, and I find it's CNN chirps in on what's going on there a little bit too, don't they?
Yes,
you have to
they
go
do.
searching for it.
Sure.
And there's an article that deals with the Persian Gulf. I think we should talk a little bit about this. They're deploying aircraft carriers and not only the Persian Gulf. We just had a friend of ours who just is on his way back. He was over there, my good friend Steve, and he was talking about how the heightened awareness is that aircraft carriers coming in. I think it's a U.S. Abraham Lincoln as it's moving in there. Everybody just seemed like there's great tensions that's happening. It's dealing with this peace plan. It's dealing with Iran, and I think we're about ready to see some things really explode over there.
Potentially. In fact, here's what's really interesting is that this article from CNN handles two things.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of amazed with,
The Trump administration and how it's dealing with Iran, but they're also able at the exact same time to bring up the topic that we've already been discussing, because even in the article itself, it says Trump dances with danger in the Middle East by deploying aircraft carrier and Kushner's peace plan. So they lump the two things together, which is it's pretty interesting when you think about it. They don't even understand that they have pointed out some pretty prophetic things. So why I find that so fascinating is the first part of the article deals with the fact that Trump said that whole nuclear deal with Iran was a complete joke. There was no verification. We kept giving them money, and it was a one-sided thing that really had no way of guaranteeing that they were going to abide by it, and it sunsetted. And this is a regime that is doing such horrible things throughout the Middle East. Their aggression towards Saudi Arabia and the fact that they send all the armaments and the war materials to Gaza.
Yes.
All of the things that they're doing, their involvement.
Just even in their homeland, there are
Sure.
human rights violations
Yes.
they have against women and everybody else. I mean, for us at all to spin Iran as feeling sorry for them, I think that's a mistake. I mean, go ahead.
Well,
Chris.
they're doing exactly that. Their belligerence in that part of the world is fascinating, especially in light of their very prominent position that they have in Ezekiel's prophecy. They are the first people mentioned after the whole Gog Magog, the beginning of that. So, what is the remnant of Ezekiel looking at it in a geographical time of his would be what we would consider portions of modern-day Russia. The first involved in that coalition is Persia, so Iran. But here's how it just shows you that the way that things are reported are intended to push an agenda. And they don't understand the prophetic part of this, so
Yes.
CNN says
Yeah.
it this way. It's just the second
Yeah.
paragraph.
Yes.
The U.S. appears to be banging war drums at the same time that it's conversely and perhaps superficially extending an olive branch just a few hundred miles away. I mean, just that first sentence is like, you already have your minds made up here.
We're the bad people right away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it says, but the events in the Levant and the Persian Gulf. The last administration used that term all the time, the Levant.
Yeah.
It is a backhanded slap at Israel because the Levant was just a geographical area that included parts of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Israel. So this is a way, without even recognizing Israel.
They mapped it out by saying this.
The Levant.
The Levant, without speaking of Israel, and recognize the capital, what we talked about in previous programs.
Yeah, look at this, the Levant and the Persian Gulf. So they might say, well, it's not a slap against Israel, we're just talking about that whole area.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you could say Israel and surrounding nations or whatever else, but it's their way of not even recognizing them. So it says, both are armed and strong-arming parties into accepting the tough demands of America and its allies, and both could propel decades-long tensions towards a new and possible even more violent chapter in the region's history. So notice, if there's anything that doesn't work out of this, now it's going to be Trump's fault, as though everything has been nice before.
Yeah.
So it's just the way that things are reported.
He's not going to win on this one. It doesn't look like it.
He can't win on anything because they just hate him so much. But then the rest of the article is, or the first half of the article is dealing with Trump or the administration pushing back on the open belligerence of Iran. And so we sent a strike group into the area, carriers and all the attending ships that go with it, put them right in the Persian Gulf. And
I think you mentioned it earlier about our old President Obama, and he made that deal with Iran, somewhat to slap them on the wrist and say, you guys aren't going to be messing with the nuclears, and hope to be able to settle down. We're to check them and going to really slow down their activity in the nuclear warfare. But Chris, the best I could tell, it hasn't slowed down at all.
No, absolutely not, because that was the problem with it in the first place. There was no way, and we couldn't just show up and say, I demand to see that right there.
Yeah.
That building right there. You had to give them a heads up that you were coming. You had to get okays, and they didn't even have to tell you where all of their places were. We gave them a whole bunch of money up front that was supposedly frozen assets, and we took off a bunch of sanctions. And here, the new administration says the deal was a joke.
Yes.
And Iran is using every bit of leverage that it has to stir up trouble in the Middle East. The sanctions are going back in. We're withdrawing from that silly thing.
Yes.
And we'll negotiate something new, or you'll get nothing. And so the sanctions are really creating some paranoia among the leadership in Iran.
Let me read this out of the CNN article. It says, in April, Trump ratcheted up pressure on Iran, removing oil exportation, and acted as a lifetime for sanction-ridden Tehran, announcing that he intended to deploy the USS Abraham Lincoln in the region. The aircraft carrier making its way to the Persian Gulf on May 5th. And so not only is that putting pressure on them, it's also affecting their people there in Iran. Right. So it seems like the politicians are going to have to do something.
Sure.
Because you can't have them ask your people to live in shortage you can for a short period of time,
Sure.
but not an extended period of time, which they've been doing. And so these sanctions that not only Trump is doing, but the European community is now agreeing with Trump. Last I read, to enforce these sanctions against them. And so Iran's feeling the pressure, and either they're going to change, which we don't see that happening, or else they're going to react in some way. Sure. And that's the concern and reason why we have those aircraft carriers out there.
Exactly, and what'll be interesting this time around, there was a prime opportunity for the people that were done with the mullahs running Iran in the last administration, and it seems like the last administration, when they were ready to do it and overthrow that government like they did in '79 that brought in this mess, then we instantly pulled the rug right out from under them. So I think that they would probably be the people that don't want to live under that tyranny of the mullahs and the Islamization of the country are probably afraid to try to step out again, thinking that we'll do the same subversive thing that we did the last time. I think quietly Trump is willing to say, if you people will rise up, we'll support you this time, and you will have us there to help you get rid of those guys.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting thing to see. And it's funny how CNN tries to link these two things together, and they're very
peace
anti-Trump.
plan and what's happening in Iran.
Yeah, because they go right into that.
Yes,
and they mention what we read on the last program, but CNN has some details that weren't in that Newsweek article. And one of this was that it says this way: Trump's senior advisor, son-in-law of Jared Kushner, unfurled the first part of a long-awaited peace plan for the Israelis and the Palestinians. The events appear out of sync, but the underlying messages were similar, though only the economic dimensions of the so-called peace plan could be unveiled. Kushner has signaled that the Palestinians would make political concessions. Quote, people are letting their grandfather's conflict destroy their children's futures. This will present an exciting, realistic, and viable pathway forward that does not currently exist. And again, as we looked at the last time, they're saying we're not even inviting the foreign ministers and the politicians. We are only dealing with foreign investors and the people in those territories that have any kind of economic understanding.
So
those are the only ones coming.
They can't come to the party.
Nope, we're not even inviting them, which is an amazing thing to do, because it takes the politicians who love to gum up the works with saying land, settlements, colonization, all the rest of that nonsense. And so what you have right here it is. This is what we know that's got them so much worked up. And what is different about this, and you can back me on this, or you can tell me, no, I've seen it before, but listen to this. The senior administration, from our administration official, said the plan would discuss 4 major components: infrastructure, industry, empowering and investment in people, and government reforms. They have never talked about these things before. So it says the initiative comes after Trump strengthened Israel's hand on some final status issues, since the status of Jerusalem and the right to return for Palestinian refugees. He has recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, withdrawn vital funds from Palestinian refugees. That is not true, by the way. He just took money out of the hands of the terrorists.
Yeah. Yes.
Quit sending it to guys like the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also vowed to annex West Bank settlements, illegal according to international law. Wow. Well, that international law is put out mainly by the United Nations that is just foaming at the mouth anti-Israeli. And it says the promise was made in the closing days of the election campaign. So yeah, he's making good on a lot of campaign promises.
You know, the thing is so beautiful with this is that, as what you're saying about these guys, is that for them to come in, let's say if you're a foreign investor and you want to come into a land to be able to invest your money and do it, your company's money, you have to see at the bottom line there's a return.
Yes.
And what they're saying is that Kushner and Trump and the rest of the guys is, if you invest in these lands, you're going to, as a businessman, you're going to see it be in profit.
Sure.
And so they must see something that we don't see, or as they're going to roll out, that's going to be appealing to these companies. That are really, a lot of money is going to be poured in there. And what government, what group of people wouldn't want that.
Sure.
And that's an
Exactly.
amazing approach that you have to this.
Well, as we said, I think it was in the
Or
last
they did.
program, if the powers that be in the Palestinian Authority have their way, there'll never be a peace plan, because if there is, then they have no reason to exist, because at that point there are no victims to claim victimhood for.
Yeah.
So when I read this I thought was interesting, and I don't know if you picked up on this, but it says Palestinian Liberation Organization Secretary Saeb Erekat. Wait a minute, they're not called the PLO anymore. They want to be called the Palestinian Authority. After Yasser Arafat dies,
Yes.
they changed the name of the organization away from that so that it sounds palatable to the world.
Yeah,
They're still terrorists.
They didn't want to identify with that anymore.
Sure. So Mahmoud Abbas or Saeb Erekat, any of these guys that have been around the whole time, they're the same terrorists. They just wear suits.
Yeah.
And they don't have a kufiya and army garb on. So it says Erekat said the solution to the conflict is not about improving living conditions under occupation, but about reaching Palestinians' full potential by ending Israeli occupation. So that's not even the crazy Hamas people down in Gaza. These are supposed to be the moderates that are running the West Bank, and he says that, which tells you it doesn't matter how good whatever they would want to do, they put it on the table, it won't see the light of day, because these guys will never give up the fight to be able to say, we're the victims, and until Israel is dispatched, we can't have peace.
They have an objective still to wipe out
They do.
Israel as it exists today.
Sure.
And bring in their own way of doing things.
This might be a good thing. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No,
This
no.
might be a good thing for the listeners or the viewers. You can do a simple search on the internet to find the stated goals. They have charters for the Palestinian Liberation Organization or of Hamas. They have their entire charter put there. You read that and you'll find out that the PLO or the Palestinian Authority, same group, they have the same objectives. How do we get rid of Israel? Hamas goes a step further and says we'll do it by conquest and killing the Jews, but until they're gone, there can't be peace. On that, they both agree, and it's put there in writing.
Mm-hmm.
So any kind of overtures of peace is just window dressing.
Well, they could try. But God's
Sure.
like we mentioned, that this won't happen. Last week or this week we're in Isaiah, and I like to, as we're like we always do. Program seems to go so fast. I like to read a verse out of Isaiah and maybe have Chris comment out of it. Isaiah chapter 42, we read, "I am the Lord; that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Behold, the former things things have come to pass, and new things I declare." And it says, "I declare before they spring forth, I tell you of them." Chris, why don't you share as we close here a little bit about that?
I love that one. In the second part of it, at verse 9, is where he says, as he said so many times in these chapters, I can tell you the things before they happen. I
Yes.
tell you, and then they come to pass. It's the first part of that that's so interesting that you read, that he says, I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will share with none other.
Yeah.
So he puts himself, as he does consistently, in a totally different group. When it comes to the matter of peace, peace will never come to the Middle East until the Prince of Peace brings it, Jesus. Now, in this is a very interesting passage. That I'm the Lord, that is my name. He's the sovereign, that's who he is.
Yes.
And he won't share that glory, that position with anyone else. In chapter 17 of John, chapter 17, verse 5, Jesus says, as he's about to go to the cross, and he's coming back to where he started, he says, now, Father, glorify me with the glory that you and I shared before the world was.
Wow.
Which is just a great way of Jesus being able to say, I'm not contradicting this.
Yeah.
I happen to be one with the Father.
And he doesn't share it with other nations. He doesn't share another way of saying, with these people right now who rise up and shake their fists towards God, their day will come. But what about your day?
Yeah.
The Bible really tells us that if any person humbles himself, that God will lift them up. If you humble yourself before the Lord this day, God will not only bless you, but he'll welcome you to the family of God. And that's our prayers. You're to be challenged through these programs that you will come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. As you can see behind me, I'm sitting in front of the East Gate there in Jerusalem around the wall. We're going to not only be talking about Israel, we'll be talking about some artificial intelligence, and then we'll be looking at the scriptures, the things that Jesus had to say concerning the days that we're living in. Remember, this program is called Living in the Last Days. I believe that we're there. I hope that you have that same point of view, because the scripture really does speak about the days and the hours that we're living in right now. We also like to say on this program that we need to watch and be ready. You'll be hearing me saying that quite often, as how important it is for us as believers to watch and be ready. But also what I bring your attention from an article that I received. It's from News Bites. It comes out of Calvary Chapel, Appleton. They compile these prophecy updates and keep us informed what's happening, not necessarily in the mainline news. The first article that I want to bring your attention, or the main article today, is they found from prophecynewswatch.com, prophecynewswatch.com, where the title reads, "No Place to Hide. Facial recognition technology will end your prophecy." And what they're saying is something that we thought was something that Hollywood made up many years ago, where the computers and cameras will be able to see your face, recognize your face, and be able to identify who you are. And so the article said no place to hide. But what they wanted to really talk about is what they have developed in China. Over in China. Let me read this to you if you haven't heard about this yet. This is the Chinese police in Nanjing made news in mid-April when the press reported the arrest of a concert of a man wanted for fraud. He says that he was at a concert. The story was huge because of the automatic facial recognition system linked through and now 176, notice 176, not thousands, but 176 million cameras across the country. And so what they're saying over in China, the police have now hooked up to 176 million cameras. And when they had this huge concert, an event that was going on, they were tapped into the concert and they saw this wanted man, and they were able to go right at and grab it. They also said that by 2020 in China, 600 million cameras will be in place where they'll be able to watch people at all time. They now have developed, it goes on, computer algorithms where they'll be able to really track down these people and really be able to tell who they are through the video feeds. And I think it's amazing what they're wanting to do. So, when I look at these, sometimes I wonder, how in the world does this affect our end times? All this new technology that's going on, from the cell phone technology right now. I think it's amazing how people are able to watch you, and how they could almost see every fingerprint that you use on your computer. Maybe you've been one who have searched for Google and say, hey, where can I buy a new cell phone, right? If you put that into your Google search, every time that you come up on any site that you might be looking at, up comes these pop-up ads, and you'll be seeing everything that you can imagine about cell phones because you did a search. Of course, behind the scenes, these computer algorithms, as they're building them, and certainly with facial recognition, the research is expanding at tremendous time. The book of Daniel talks about during the last days, our education and our knowledge is going to increase tremendously. I believe that the direct purpose of that verse really talks about our knowledge of the last days. But also, as we're seeing the technology age expanding quicker than we can even write about or even report about it, I see this as all kind of tying together. And so you wonder if this is all playing into what is in the book of Revelation after the rapture of the church during this time of tribulation, where it says that men and women won't be able to buy unless they receive a mark of the beast. And the idea is that some way or other they'll be able to track our buy-in, the way we sell things, the way we purchase things, unless we receive a mark. I think it's interesting as we look at these things. It tells us also, this article, it speaks of a report from Georgetown University on the as they did a study on the Center of Privacy and Technology, revealed that in 2016, 26 states here in the United States are already sharing facial recognition as they collect data, and they said they were shared it with the FBI. As that was in 2016, as it says, it just continues to grow across our nation. These things, as we start seeing them, I really think it's so important that we as Christians, that we really do look up, that we see our Redeemer coming so close.
I'm Chuck Smith, and I'm also concerned about man's survival upon this planet. For many years, I've been studying the sociological trends, the population patterns, and the environmental conditions. As man has been living so thoughtlessly as though there were no tomorrow, it is rather frightening to realize that he might awake one of these mornings and find there is no tomorrow. We have carelessly wasted the natural resources that God has given unto us. We have sown to the wind, and now the time has come when we must reap the whirlwind. The population did not reach 1 billion until 1867. Yet by 1935, there were 2 billion people. By 1965, it rose to 3 billion. And by 1975, 4 billion.
We are very close to a time, early in the next century, when it would be possible, if this process continued, for the total world population to double in 20 years. Well, you wouldn't have to continue this very much longer before the population would be doubling in 20 minutes.
Ozone is a minor but extremely important constituent gas in the stratosphere. Stratospheric ozone screens harmful ultraviolet radiation from the Earth's surface. It is therefore principally the potential effects of increased harmful ultraviolet radiation, such as skin cancer and biological and agriculture effects, that are of concern.
DDT is what you might call the uninvited additive. It is in the food chain, it's in man's food chain, it's in the ecosystem of the planet, and it poses
From an environmental standpoint, this is an extremely serious situation. The environment has been giving us warnings and serving as a monitor for a long time, and in many ways we haven't heeded those warnings.
Another of the major concerns today is the energy supply on the planet Earth. As man is using up the fossil fuels which cannot be replaced, he is turning more and more to the use of atomic fuels. These also pose a problem to the survival of man in finding a safe way to dispose of the waste materials that are still highly radioactive. Solar energy has often been suggested as a viable alternative, but with the billions of dollars and also the time needed to develop this resource, it is extremely doubtful if it can be ready in time to avoid disaster. When the age of industrialization came, it seemed to promise man a utopia, a way to improve the quality of life on the earth. The need for fuel necessary to run this industrial complex can be the very thing that will destroy man, as it eats up all of his natural resources. Another specter haunting man is the dwindling food supply. With the population increasing so rapidly, and 2/3 of the world already suffering from malnutrition, the scientists that have studied this problem are quite concerned about the next 20 years, when they anticipate that the present population will have doubled.
On the average, about once a year from the time of Christ, we have had major famines that have killed large numbers of people in localized areas. This year, there will be 120 million new individuals born. Roughly 15 million will die before they reach the age of 5 through causes that are related to inadequate food. That represents 1/3 of the total death rate that will occur this year. 48 million people will die. 15 million of them will be babies who die because of malnutrition. The situation is even more grim and more tragic than that. One of the most important forms of undernutrition and malnutrition is the failure of the child to get adequate protein resources to support its growth during its very early childhood development. If this happens, then the brain simply does not develop normally. These children grow up permanently stunted in their mental capacities. 7 of 10 are permanently stunted because of failure to obtain adequate sources of protein. What are the prospects for improvement of this situation? Not particularly good.
We have not been routinely immunizing against smallpox since 1971 because there's been no smallpox here for years, and therefore each year there were more complications from the immunization and no one was getting smallpox, so it was decided that it was unwise to immunize people. So soon we will have a whole generation of unimmunized people, and the prospect of enemy action seeding smallpox virus into our atmosphere is quite frightening.
The fact is that a biological agent, when used according to certain doctrines, can have a very devastating and final effect on the personnel on whom it's used. The biological agent is a very large coverage weapon. It can be sprayed from aircraft, it can cover a very, very large area, and it can infect very many people in that area.
There are also grave concerns about the social upheavals in our society. It is not surprising that the crime, which is another severe problem, is increasing more rapidly among the children and teenagers than any other age group.
The American nuclear family, the mother, father, and the children, working together as an integral unit, has been disintegrating in our country. And this disintegration is costing us a terrible price. It isn't just the suffering from crime. Crime, of course, is essentially a youthful phenomenon, and the crime-prone age group tends to move down now to where the median age for burglars happens to be around 14 or 15, depending on the community. But really the reason it's the country's greatest problem, in my opinion, is because it really comes from a breakdown in the American family. Why do we have 1 out of 2 marriages breaking up today? Well, I think the morality of the American people has been shattered by the new morality, so-called situation ethics.
Because of man's desperation, he has become a prey to all kinds of false messiahs who offer non-reason religious experiences as a solution to his dilemmas. It is always startling to observe the incredible lies man will believe once he has rejected the truth. One of the most awesome of nature's phenomena is the earthquake. It is a helpless feeling when that which is thought to be terra firma suddenly begins to move under your feet. Earthquakes have been increasing in the last century at an alarming rate. I am not here to give you a story of doom. I am convinced that in spite of all of the gloomy forecasts by the social scientist and the environmentalist, the world is on the verge of the most glorious age that man has ever known. All of these things that have been happening on our planet, the famines, earthquakes, the pestilences, the world wars, the false messiahs, are events that were predicted by Jesus Christ as signs of the end of man's futile efforts to govern himself. In the Bible, there are predictions of world events that must have seemed absolutely incredible to the people of that day and age. Even as recently as 200 years ago, many men scoffed at the predictions. The prophet Daniel, 2,500 years ago, said that in the last days, there will be an increase in man's knowledge and technology to the extent that man would be traveling around the world. 200 years ago, the famous French philosopher Voltaire, speaking of Sir Isaac Newton, said, "Look at the mighty mind of Newton. When he got in his dotage, he began to study the book called the Bible. And it seems in order to credit its fabulous nonsense, we must believe, says Newton, that the knowledge of mankind will be so increased that we shall be able to travel at 50 miles an hour. The poor dotard. Brilliant men like Voltaire mocked the men of faith. And yet we see that Newton's faith has been substantiated, whereas Voltaire's criticism now seems foolish. From a biblical standpoint, one of the reasons I believe that man has come to the end of his time is the rebirth of the nation Israel. It is an event that was predicted by most of the Bible prophets and by Jesus Christ himself. As he gave the signs of the last days, he told his disciples that when the fig tree began to bud forth, that they would know that summer was nigh. Even though, he said, my coming is at the door. Then Jesus said that that generation would not pass until all of these things be fulfilled. So the rebirth of the nation Israel marks the final generation of man upon the earth in this present order. And God took Ezekiel into a valley that was full of dry bones and scattered. And God said to Ezekiel, can these bones be made to live again? And Ezekiel said, Lord, thou knowest. And he watched as these bones came together. They formed a skeleton. And then flesh came upon the skeleton and muscles. And God said, and so shall I gather again my people Israel that have been scattered among the heathen. And I will bring them back into their own land, and I will establish them there. And so God has kept this ancient promise to his people. He has brought them back into their land. He has established them there. And so we saw the miracle of a nation born in a day. We stand across from the Knesset, which houses the Israeli government, and here we see the fulfillment of God's wonderful word. Jerusalem the golden, Jerusalem the eternal city, the city of ancient and modern charm. For Jerusalem is a city, David said, that has been joined together. The scripture actually means that people have come together within Jerusalem, and here we see an interesting blend of Arab and Israeli alike living side by side. The word in the Hebrew actually means where people of all races can come together. Behind us is the Western Wall, which to the Jew is one of the most sacred places in the world. For just beyond this wall was Solomon's temple, exactly where we do not know. But yet there at one time was the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwelt in the midst of his people. This is as close as they can come to that holy place. And since 1967, they have now been able once again to come and offer their prayers here at the Western Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall because they were not allowed here by the Arabs, but now that it is under Jewish control once again, they can come and once more worship their God in this sacred place. While in Europe, one sees an interesting formation of 10 nations federating together to form the European Community, which is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It is incredible to realize that the building that I am sitting in front of has the potential of fulfilling a prophecy that was made over 2,500 years ago. This prophecy is recorded in the book of Daniel. We read that when Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon, the first major world-governing empire, that one night before he went to sleep, he was wondering, what is to come of the world? What will become of my empire? What will follow after me? And that night he had a very interesting dream. The dream troubled him extremely. When he woke up in the morning, he could not remember the dream, and he was curious as to its meaning. And so he gathered together his wise men and counselors, but they were not able to help him. Finally, Daniel was brought in, and Daniel said unto the king, God has shown to you the kingdoms of the world, those empires that will govern this world. In your dream, you saw a great image. It had a head of gold. It had shoulders of silver. It had a stomach of brass and feet of iron and clay. Daniel said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, but your empire is to be replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire, the shoulders of silver. That empire, in turn, will be replaced by the Grecian Empire, the stomach of brass. That, in turn, by the Roman Empire, the legs of iron. The final world governing empire will be a federation of European nations that are related to the Roman Empire, but they will be joined together in a democratic union. In the European community, we find the potential for the final world governing empire. A leader is going to arise to rule over the European community that will almost hypnotize people. He will speak of peace, and the world that is searching for survival will hail him as their Messiah. However, the scriptures warn us that he is a false Messiah, for he is called the Antichrist by the word of God. And so we see this building, which houses the economic European community, and here is the potential for the fulfillment of these prophecies.
In 1951, under the Kennedy round of negotiations, it was the posture of the U.S. government to encourage the formation of the European community so as to have a strong Atlantic partner to help defend the free world. Today, we're becoming aware of the fact we have not so much a partner as a very able competitor. We have special studies that are exploring the takeovers of U.S. companies and banks by European interests. We have feature articles in some of our media, Europe, America's new rival. We have Forbes, is United States technology failing? Who now builds a better mousetrap?
What is happening to the dollar is of great concern to the average American family today. The dollar is devaluating on the foreign markets, and its purchasing power is diminishing in the United States. There is also the problem in the use of money itself, especially in all of the crimes where money is the primary object stolen. A solution that has been suggested is to assign every individual a number that will be tattooed under the skin of his hand or upon his forehead.
Family in Florida wants to be the first implanted with medical microchips, but a Canadian woman may have already beaten him to the punch. As Tech Live's Matt Markovich reports, there's no medical reason behind her implants. In fact, she says she just wanted to prove a point.
When Nancy Nesbitt left her vet after getting her dog chipped, she had an idea.
So this is an x-ray of my two hands, clearly showing the microchips.
Why not get chipped herself?
I mean, I look at your x-ray, it's between the bones. Can you feel that in your hand there?
No, I don't. I can't feel it within my own hand, but if I touch it, I can feel it. Yeah, the chip is inside the barrel of that needle there, and once he pushes the needle in as to the right location, then there's a little plunger which he's pushing now, which goes through the barrel of the needle and pushes out the chip into my hand.
The world is now coming very close to that moment when the scripture will be fulfilled, which tells us that no man can buy or sell except he have a number on his right hand or on his forehead. Though there is a tremendous potential for the European nations to become a world governing empire, they will never rise to that stature until something is done about the great threat that Russia poses to Western Europe. It was reported in one of the national magazines recently that Russia has over 28,000 tanks in Eastern Europe ready to strike. Our own intelligence agencies believe that Europe will fall within 36 hours from the time of Russia's initial attack. Therefore, we have no hope of holding Europe against this massive Russian force. Thus, in order for Western Europe to ever be a world governing empire, something must be done about this Russian threat. Interestingly enough, the Bible states that Russia will be destroyed in an abortive invasion of Israel. In all the recent wars, and especially the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel fought for its very survival, Russia was deeply involved. When the Syrians began their attack on October 6, 1973, they had some of Russia's latest equipment, such as this T-62 tank. And with 1,800 tanks, they attacked across this upper end of the Golan Heights in a 20-mile battle perimeter. When we stopped to realize that when Hitler began his great invasion of Russia, that he had 1,000 tanks over a 200-mile perimeter, we realized what an intensive attack that was. A few hours after the attack began, at 2 in the afternoon, the Russian planes began to bring fresh supplies to both Syria and Egypt. The Russian technicians had trained the Egyptians and the Syrians. Few people realize how much Russia was involved in the 1973 war against Israel. 3 days before the war began, Russia put 2 spy satellites into orbit in order to film the battle conditions. A lieutenant in the Israeli army told me of the capture of Russian troops on the Golan Heights. When the tide of battle turned against Egypt and Syria, and the forces of General Sharon had trapped the 3rd Egyptian Army, the first ones to know that the 3rd Army was trapped were the Russians. This knowledge they received through their spy satellites. It was then that Russia began to press for a ceasefire. At 10:45 in the evening of October 24th, Dobrynin came to Kissinger with a message from Brezhnev. This note has been described by those who read it as brutal and threatening. According to the officials who read it, the content was, "We strongly urge that we both send forces to enforce the ceasefire, and if you do not, we may be obliged to consider acting alone." It is reported that Russia was loading paratroopers in the planes ready to invade Israel, and troop ships were on their way. 1973 was almost the end. President Nixon reacted to the note by calling a worldwide alert for our American forces. He probably averted World War III because a ceasefire was soon decided upon and the Middle East settled again into an unsteady peace. The Israelis were forced once again to fight for their lives and for the right to exist in this little piece of land. That you and I wake up to the fact that God is serious, that he does mean what he says, and that we are in these end times, and we must really make that commitment to Jesus Christ. Looking forward to hearing from you, and God bless you.
Life was filled with guns and war, and everyone got trampled on the floor. I wish we'd all been ready. Children died cold, a piece of bread could buy a bag of gold. I wish we'd all been ready. There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind. A man and wife asleep in bed. She hears a noise and turns her head. He's gone. I wish we'd all been ready. Two men walking up a hill. One disappears and one's left standing still. I wish we'd all been ready. There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind.